Welcome to the latest in our series of webinars on PFI, expiry and handback. As usual, I'm joined by three brilliant guests. This time I've got Nigel Badham, who's a partner in Knight Frank's public sector advisory team. Sarah Channin from Equans, who heads up their PFI handback team. You'll see from Sarah's bio, she's got oversight of 60 projects. So she's going to be quite busy over the coming years. Good luck, Sarah. And finally, Rosie Pearson, who's a corporate director at Local Partnerships. So the focus of the webinar today is planning on for life after PFI expiry. And this is important, as you'll have gathered from the IPA guidance, that future plans play a key role in developing the handback strategy for any project. This will be the same format as normal, so I'll pose some carefully crafted questions at our panelists, and then there'll be some time at the end to pick up any questions that you might have. So as Tom says, please pop those in the Q&A and not in the chat, because otherwise I won't see them. So just to kick us off, most of the focus to date on PFI expiry has been around the handback process, carrying out surveys and the like. And there hasn't been a huge amount of discussion as to what life might look like after PFI. So before we get there, what do the panel think the public sector needs to be doing now in order to plan for life after PFI? Maybe Rosie, you could kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, James, and good afternoon, everybody. To think about life after PFI, you need to really think about what's needed. Currently, you've got an asset or assets, but part of the contract, and they'll be providing certain services. But what's needed after that? How long have you got to go? What does life look like? So what services are required? What assets are required? Are they what you've currently got now? In which case, what do you need to do to make sure that there's a smooth transition? Will there be something different? Depending on the type of contract, you know, if it's a school, are the schools still required? Will they be transferred to an academy, for example? So actually, if you're a contracting authority, you need to have discussions with the academy trusts to figure out what they're going to need going forwards. If it's office accommodation, actually the way in which we work, you know, most of us today are probably working from home. The nature of how we work and where we work has changed. So there really needs to be that thorough kind of thinking, early discussions within the public sector, within the contracting authority, of what do we need after this contract expires? What does that mean in terms of now going forward for the remainder of the contract? And then obviously doing the procurements, doing, you know, the business cases, etc., for life afterwards. But what's critical is that stakeholder engagement. So bringing your provider into those discussions once you've established what's needed, so that they know where you're going in the future, what's happening to these assets, and what that means for the remainder of the contract, what that means on handover and potential future work for them as well.
Okay, thanks, Rosie. Nigel, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, James. Hi, everyone. Yeah, this is a point that you know, we've been making for some time, and you know, there's been a huge focus around the kind of webinars, conferences, even the IPA document is very focused on what does contracts say and how do you establish the condition surveys to get the asset back in the condition that you should get. And you know, as Rosie said, service delivery methods have changed massively in the last 25 to 30 years. You know, hybrid working has now become a kind of major feature of the work environment. So the suitability of the assets to deliver those services really has to be kind of brought into question. You know, quite often these assets are part of a wider estate portfolio that's held by the public sector. And you know, this asset coming back in needs to be considered in the context of that portfolio. There's been huge changes to technology in that period, which need to be taken into account. And, you know, we're now on COP27. So, you know, climate change has really only been on the agenda for, you know, the relatively kind of near past. So the commitments that the public sector have made to net zero carbon, decarbonisation, you know, this is an opportunity for them to kind of start thinking about, you know, the asset that they are getting back, and actually is what the contract says they should get, is that really the best solution for them?
Thanks, Nigel. Sarah, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think as both Rosie and Nigel have kind of said, I think there's been a tendency to look at handback as almost an end in itself rather than as a means to transition, which is really what it is. And there's been a real focus on, you know, condition surveys and the condition of facilities at that all important handback date, rather than maybe looking at, as Rosie says, you know, the needs going forward. What should we be trying to get those facilities to move towards? And I think the other one from a service provider's perspective that you'll probably hear me mention a few times this afternoon is, you know, yes, there's been a focus on facilities, and that's right that there should be, but actually we need to also think about the people involved. I mean, there's real people involved in these contracts, and that's their jobs. And if we don't have that kind of vision of where the facilities are moving to, what they're going to do next, then how do you give people that certainty of where they're going to be in, you know, 5 years' time? And if you can't give them that certainty, then it's a risk for those people, but it's also a risk for the facilities and for the public sector. You know, what's going to happen to that workforce if you can't give them that indication of where it's going? So yes, the focus on facilities needs to happen, but I think we mustn't forget the people in all of this.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So my next question was, before we get to expiry, what should the public sector be doing in order to help meet its objectives? So if they kind of work out what they want to do post PFI, what should they be talking to their provider about how they can make things, how they can help them to achieve those objectives? Maybe we'll go to Rosie on that one first of all.
So I think, as we mentioned in the previous, the answer to the previous question, figuring out what you need. Just as Sarah said, you know, expiry isn't the be all and end all. Then it's a case of having that discussion with your provider about what that looks like. If it means significant change, then why wait until the end of the PFI contract? See what can be done now. Let's be really honest about PFI contracts. You know, the ones that are approaching expiry, they've probably been operational for 15 plus years. It's probably 20 years since the business plan, the business case was done, which set out what the objectives for that project were actually going to be. How realistic are they now? How relevant are they now? So don't think all of this can wait, has to wait until expiry. Firstly, establish what you want to do, what you need to do, and make sure that there's certainty within the contracting authority that that is the right kind of option, and you do want to make changes if there are changes. Then have the conversation with your provider about what that means. It could mean repurposing life cycle, for example. It could mean, actually, if we don't need this asset, what does that mean? Can we, you know, wind down to some extent, bring some of the, look at bringing some of the funds out and using them elsewhere. Another key thing is actually understanding what happens to the asset at the end of the contract in the first place. They don't all transfer. Some of them there's residual value, some of them stay with the private sector, some of them will transfer to other stakeholders. So bringing the relevant people involved as well.
Thanks, Rosie. Maybe I'll throw that over to Sarah. There's something of a challenge there for the private sector to assist the public sector. Do you have any thoughts on
yeah,
that?
Absolutely. And actually, James, as you say, I think it should be viewed as an opportunity for the public sector to make use of that workforce that they have while it's in place. You know, as Rosie says, don't wait until it's all yours to have to deal with. You've got private sector partners in there with you now who you can call on to talk the options through with. I mean, yes, you have to understand your contracts, but once you understand your contracts, then you can consider whether or not you want to make any agreements outside of that, whether you want to do things differently. Do you want to stick rigidly to what the contract says? Rosie talked about repurposing life cycle. For a lot of these facilities, like for like replacements aren't going to be appropriate depending on what they want to do with them beyond the expiry date. So you need to look at all of that. And as Nigel said previously, the way that we're working has changed, but actually the way that we're operating and maintaining buildings is changing as well. And that's something else that the public sector needs to be aware of and needs to consider. Is there opportunity to put in building automation and IoT technology, and do you want to start looking at that kind of thing now in advance of losing that private sector expertise and workforce that you have available to you?
Thanks, Sarah. Nigel, can you finish us off on this one?
Yeah, I think, you kind of get the impression that for the public sector, taking on the challenge of expiry, following the IPA guidance, and focusing on getting back what you should get back is a challenge in itself. And, that's going to need resourcing up to start doing the kind of planning that we talked about with your first question, James. You're looking at what's the service delivery strategy, what's your estate strategy, how does this asset fit into the broader public sector offering? So, it's really challenging the public sector even more to say, actually, you need to do a bit more thinking than what the IPA is suggesting. You need to involve the directorates from across service delivery, estates, even HR and IT. And it's really kind of dealing with it as a project in its own sense. So making sure that you understand what the timescales are, factoring in time for condition surveys, for instance, but also things like the governance. If you are going to go down a slightly diverse route, then, what governance is needed, what sign-off is needed for that? Do you need Green Book business case approval from Treasury, for instance? So there's quite a lot of thought goes into it, which probably for public sector bodies are thinking, well, it's hard enough just doing the basic handback, but, the opportunity is there to get something much more useful back than you would if you adhered strictly to the contract.
Thank you, Nigel. There's a lot of focus on utilities costs at the moment for everybody, including the public sector. But I wonder whether the panel thought there's any scope to use the PFI to assist the public sector in managing their utilities costs. Maybe if I'll go to Nigel first of all on that.
Yeah, I think all the parties within the PFI contract are incentivized in one way or another to reduce energy costs. Certainly the latter PFI contracts where there were energy risk share arrangements, so private sector took consumption risk because they designed buildings to meet certain targets, with the public sector taking tariff risk. So the private sector should be perfectly incentivized to replace low quality, out of date M&E plant, for instance. LED lighting is a classic, with more kind of up to date apparatus. So there's certainly scope within the PFI to do that, and there are incentives to do that. And I think one of the key points there is that currently under the PFI, it is a risk share mechanism where the private sector is taking part of the risk. Post PFI, the whole thing falls back to the public sector. So therefore, achieving what they can through upgrades, through more intelligent use of the life cycle fund, is going to benefit them post expiry when they're on the hook for the whole risk of the utilities costs.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. Feed for thought there. Sarah, what do you have to say on this?
Yeah, point? I mean, clearly utilities is a massive topic in the current climate. I think coupled with the net zero commitment, it needs to be kind of front and center of people's minds when they're looking at these facilities and anything that they might want to do in preparation for handback. Obviously, as I said already, you've got the private sector engaged, you've got experts available to you. I believe you should be making use of that expertise while you can, and using things like the available life cycle to potentially supplement what you would like to do with those facilities before you've lost that opportunity. And again, things like building automation, and I can't say that word apparently, automation and smart technologies and all of that kind of thing can help, to reduce those energy costs. All of these things need to be part of that plan for what the facilities are going to look like beyond expiry.
Thanks, Sarah. Rosie?
Yeah, completely agree with Nigel and Sarah there. And I think there's have the wider discussions. If you're within an authority or an NHS trust, for example, look at what else is happening in your non-PFI buildings and have the discussions with your provider about could that be incorporated into the PFI buildings as well. You know, look at how services are being provided, especially in relation to handback. The closer you get to the handback, the potential that actually you're going to be responsible for delivering those services, the way in which they're envisaged at the outset will not be how they're being delivered now. So actually, what's the most economical way of delivering them? But don't think of a PFI asset as a single asset. Think of it in the wider portfolio and look at that kind of cross-cutting, or what are we doing elsewhere? Can it be incorporated in, and have the conversation with your private sector partners to see what can be established now or what can be lined up ready for expiry.
Okay, thanks, Rosie. So what risks do we think there are for both public and private sector, I guess, around simply applying the contractual handback mechanism? Do you think people should be slavish in this, or do you think people need to be more imaginative? Sarah, perhaps you could kick us off.
So the handback contractual mechanisms, obviously they were drafted, you know, sometimes 20, 25 years ago potentially, and not always with necessarily the fullest view of what handback might look like at the time. So yes, while you know you have the contracts there and you need to use that as your starting point, I think there are real risks on both sides for slavishly sticking to the wording of the contracts as far as handback is concerned. And I also believe that there is genuinely room within a partnering relationship to be flexible and to have those discussions. I think there's a real risk of becoming entrenched, particularly if one side insists that you know everything needs to be in strict adherence with the contract. Then that's only going to push the other party to do the same, and then you know the chances are that goes down a route that you don't necessarily want to go down, and potentially a much more costly route. And similarly, you know, going back to the kind of life cycle point and whether or not you really want to get back what it says on the tin, you know, do you want to be handed over an archive room full of paper documents because that's what the contract says you're entitled to? So, you know, those kind of discussions need to be flexible, I believe, if we're going to get the best out of handback and actually produce the best results.
Okay, Rosie?
Contracts differ across PFI, and actually the contracts that are either expired or coming towards expiry now are the early stage contracts, where to say that the handback requirements could be quite slim, you know, in terms of their drafting, open to interpretation is kind of a key one. And I think there's that, you can slavishly go down the route of the contract says this, but actually there is so much, as Sarah said, you could end up with a truckload of paper for starters. Actually figure out what the key priorities are and then have early discussions to set expectations. That's a key thing, because actually it could be that there's ambiguity within the contractual provisions, and private sector, public sector have got completely different views on what they're reading into, what it means. Set expectations early, get the discussions, get a detailed kind of plan of what's going to happen when, to make sure that you're all delivering towards the same outcome. But I think, you know, the contracts are there for a purpose, but you have to prioritize and you have to be realistic about this and pragmatic about this. In addition, for the contracting authorities, most of the people that will be thinking about expiry will also be thinking about the day-to-day, about the operational issues, about the periodic events that happen throughout the contract, like benchmarking, as well as what's happening in the future. So they need to be realistic on what can be achieved.
I can't possibly support diverting away from contract, Rosie. I don't know what you are proposing there. It sounds like a recipe for disaster. Nigel, any thoughts?
Well, it kind of links back to what we were saying earlier, is that really the biggest risk is that the authority receives something back which it doesn't need, isn't fit for purpose. You know, something that was designed 30 years ago, you know, it's unlikely if you started with a blank sheet of paper that you would come up with that as the same solution. And I think that's kind of where the the public sector have to start is, if we had a blank sheet of paper, what would we do here? You know, it could be that if they carry out robust service delivery reviews, options appraisals of the assets, the condition surveys, it may actually be the best solution that they do just follow the contract slavishly. But it's kind of unlikely when you consider how old these buildings are and how things have moved on during that period. So it really goes back to the putting in the resource to do the proper planning, and really to kind of look at this as an opportunity to get something better than you could.
Yeah, I think the real risk is you'd be lumbered with a 1990 style asset, isn't it, for the 21st century, which isn't, you know, going to meet your objectives. And I think also, I think as Rosie alluded to, if people kind of have a very contractual approach to this, then it's going to get pretty gnarly at a very early stage. So I think that's best to be avoided. Yeah. There is something of a trend for the public sector to bring services in-house, and I think that might be very politically attractive to some, because obviously PFI's brand isn't the best. But are there any risks in the public sector for the public sector in bringing services back in-house? Nigel, any thoughts?
Obviously, what's absolutely critical here is that if through the contract services are being delivered to the public, that it's seen as a totally seamless transition. So if you go to the hospital one day as a patient, you don't see any different to the following day, and there's a help desk and there's a receptionist and the floors are cleaned and the building works. So that's the absolute critical point, is that that's seamless. You know, how those services are delivered post PFI, you know, could to a large extent depend on the other portfolio or the other assets within the portfolio of that particular public sector body. So, for instance, if you've got a major acute trust with a £300 million hospital, you know, that may constitute 95% of their assets, compared to maybe 6 school PFIs in a much larger portfolio for a public sector body. Clearly, with the latter, it would be, if there are existing arrangements in place for non-PFI schools, then whether that's in-house delivery or outsourced, then that would be the obvious solution, I guess. Whereas to start from scratch with a major acute hospital, you know, it really does need a lot of thought. It needs options appraisals. You know, you need to be looking at what's the scope of service. Have you got enough information there actually to go out to the market if you need to? So I'm sure Sarah, as a FM expert, will come on to it, but you know, there are all sorts of issues around 2P transfer of staff. You know, will staff actually transfer when you expect them to? Because if they don't, then, you know, you're really kind of stuck with recruiting potentially hundreds of people. And if you've been relying on the private sector providing, you know, a whole myriad of services for a facility for 25, 30 years, you're unlikely to have the management capability to deal with that.
Okay, well, I think that neatly segues into Sarah to comment on
I think Nigel said it for me. I mean, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole question around capability and capacity in terms of what the public sector can actually take on board. And yeah, again, as Nigel says, the people part of this is going to be key. If the public sector is looking to take on board that workforce, then again, the sooner that, you know, those discussions and communications can go out to try and reassure the people involved that there are jobs continuing, then that will all help. I mean, I think the other big one for me in terms of the risk of taking things in-house is just to be cognizant of the fact that PFI at its core was a risk transfer exercise. Regardless of how well you think that did or didn't work, the public sector would need to be aware that if it takes it all back, then all of that risk comes back in-house, as well as the actual service provision, and needs to have a serious look at what that means for them and whether that's actually appetizing.
That's a good point. Rosie?
I think Yeah, the starting point from the public sector's perspective needs to be, if it's bringing something in-house, is that the right decision? Is that the best decision? So they need to look at all the options. And that's one of the reasons why you need to think about PFI contract expiry way before the actual contract expiry date, because this takes time. If bringing services in-house is the right decision, then obviously the transfer and all the issues that Sarah and Nigel have talked about are critical to make sure there's that seamless service provision. If it's, you know, going out and outsourcing again, then looking at what that means, doing a procurement and what the scope of services means, and considering what the risk profile looks like, because actually your options aren't just in-house or external provider. It's, well, what level of risk transfer do we add it into a different contract that we've already got established, and ultimately who's going to be responsible for providing these services? Again, if it's a school, it could be going to a school's contract, could have more than one school, should in most cases have more than one school, could have multiple trusts, academy trusts, which means that actually the services within a specific school will go to different trusts. It might be that they've got one or two schools in that trust. It might be that they've got a number of schools, in which case they can add it onto an existing contract. But it's looking at all the options, figuring out which is most appropriate for that contract, and there'll be no one size fits all, and then doing that in sufficient time to be able to ensure that there's that seamless transfer.
Thank you, Rosie. The resourcing issue, I think, actually sounds to me pretty key, particularly given that for a lot of public sector organisations, as you know, Sarah points out, that they've had the luxury of that. Well, they may not feel it's a luxury, but they've effectively divested responsibility for managing the assets to a third party, and obviously, you know, that expertise may not be back to them. So I think that's going to be pretty critical. So if you're a public sector organisation and you decided that you're not going to need this asset post expiry for whatever reason, how do you think that should impact upon your approach to contract management? Rosie, any thoughts?
Firstly, I suppose it links into my answer to the previous question. Make sure that that's absolutely the right decision. Don't, you know, on a political whim or whatever, think actually we don't need this anymore, and start winding down services, for example. You need to make sure that's the absolute best outcome. And if something else is needed, that then you've got the appropriate work stream in place to provide an alternative. Going back to something that I said earlier, understand your contract and understand whether the asset actually does transfer to the public sector on expiry. That's a critical one, because some do, some don't, some have a residual value, and that could impact a decision as well. If the answer is no, we don't need this, and we are certain that that's the answer, then have conversations with your sponsoring department about what can be done. Have conversations with your provider about what can be done, because it does mean things like there's no, my view, there's no point doing, you know, full-on life cycle replacement, ensuring that that asset has a life of however many years post expiry. If post expiry it's going to be a white elephant, it's not going to be used, something else is going to happen to it, and services are going to be provided elsewhere. But it's make the decisions, you know, sooner rather than later. Have the conversations about what that means, and bring the private sector partner into those conversations, because it will impact the contract going forwards. And, you know, life cycle services might mean winding down, you know, not using some parts of the building, for instance. So yeah, there's options there, but they need to be fully considered.
Okay, Nigel?
Yeah, I think you know, we're all expecting that the Chancellor's going to be swinging his axe in the next few days and making huge kind of cuts to public spending, I think, is the expectation. So, you know, there's going to be a huge onus on the public sector to manage their assets properly, you know, to use them to the maximum effect. So in terms of kind of occupancy, reduced running costs. So, you know, the PFI asset is no different. It needs to be considered, as we said earlier, within the wider portfolio of assets that body has. But if out of that exercise, then, you know, there's clearly a business case to say we don't need this asset any longer, then I think how you manage the contract is very much going to be driven by what are the options with regards to the asset. So if we assume that the asset does transfer back, that which is probably the majority of the assets, I think, isn't it? You know, if the authority is looking to dispose of it as an operational asset or to sublet it, then, you know, it still needs to be in the best possible condition to get most value out of that, if you like. If the intention is to sell it off to a developer, then you may as well wind down the maintenance and the replacement, albeit within the bounds of kind of public health and safety and still the ability to deliver the services. So I think how you manage it, and kind of then leading on to the point Rosie has just made, very much depends on that options appraisal that you kind of do at the outset. And, you know, getting advice from property experts about, you know, well, what are the values? What's the local market? If we put this this office on the market, is there going to be anyone around who's going to want to lease it? You know, if that is the option, certainly it would need, you know, EPC ratings need to be high. You would need to upgrade it. So you would still need to almost manage the contract as if you were retaining it in that sense. But if you're disposing of it for redevelopment, then it's a very different approach, and you can look to make savings and agree those with the project code.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. Sarah, any thoughts as a provider?
I mean, yeah, as Rosie says, you know, I suppose the first stage is that the public sector needs to be really clear on what they want, but then the earlier that they can make that decision and start having those conversations with their private sector partners, the better, because that will shape what that looks like and that discussion going forward. And, you know, if they genuinely are not going to need the asset beyond expiry, that may allow greater flexibility within what handback looks like, allow them to do things slightly differently, and potentially look at ways of maybe making savings out of the process. And again, I'm going to come back to the people aspect, because if you don't need the facility beyond expiry, then the people situation needs to be very, very carefully managed, because you do want, presumably, service provision up until expiry. But if you don't have a facility beyond that, then, you know, that makes that an awful lot more challenging. So the sooner you can start having those discussions and trying to come together to figure out the best way of ensuring that you have what you need until the expiry date, the better. So again, just early discussions, I think, are the key.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Well, one of kind of the key themes, I think, from the discussion today is around doing things outside the contractual terms of the PFI. Now, I think one of the usual critiques is that PFI lacks flexibility. I just wondered if the panel had any views as to whether they think the market would support more innovative, non-contractual approaches to handback and expiry. Nigel, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess firstly is a challenge to, does the PFI contract actually lack flexibility? I think, you know, having been involved in signing lots of contracts in the early days, you know, there were enormous amounts of documents which were incredibly descriptive and, you know, envisaged every kind of scenario that was likely to happen. So they were very prescriptive, but, you know, there was the opportunity to be flexible. I think what kind of stymies that flexibility is that it is quite complex, time consuming to make the changes. So you need to update the contract, you possibly need to update subcontracts, you've got payment mechanism to consider, and you've got the financial model potentially needing updating to reflect changes as well. So I think the flexibility is there. It's the expense and the time consuming nature of those changes. And, you know, I think funders were heavily involved in the change process, and they need to sign off their level of due diligence. So a whole set of further advisors to give their view. And obviously in the latter days of PFI, as we get into the expiry period, quite often, we're going to be into the debt tail, and the funders will have gone off the scene. So, they're maybe not part of that complex scene. But, I think for things to change, I think investors and providers, they've got to be incentivized to agree to these changes. They've got to see that there's no perceived additional risk to what they're doing. Is there any financial impact on what they're doing? But quite often, if good relationships have been developed, there will be a willingness to find a way through things to keep those relationships going.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. So a positive take. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Nigel says, to a certain extent, it's probably all about the relationships. I mean, I genuinely, as I said earlier, I think if one party becomes, absolutely set on strict adherence to the contract, then that will push the other party down the same route, and there is a real risk of becoming entrenched. For those that have joined a number of these kind of handback webinars, I think collaboration has been a real buzzword, and it's been very much talked about within these types of sessions. At the moment, I don't believe that it necessarily reflects what we're seeing in the market. I think there is a way to go to move from kind of strict contractual adherence to collaboration. But I do genuinely believe that that's the way that it needs to go, and I think there is room to do that. And yeah, it does seem to be about relationships and talking to each other in order to be able to do that. But yes, once we can kind of get over that hurdle, I think it will allow the process to become a lot smoother if the parties can work together on that, whilst acknowledging the contractual terms, but on that kind of collaborative piece.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Rosie, any thoughts on
I think we've seen through the operational PFI contracts that are there, the changes that have happened, so there's flexibility within them. Where there are changes, I suppose the key thing for me is that anything is documented, because there's so much transition in the personnel involved in a contract. In fairness, there are some where there's still the original people who signed the contract still actively involved. They've got that corporate memory, but in so many cases, there's no memory of what decision was made and why it was made. And obviously, over time, things change, and the rationale of why this is being done, it's just not there. So the contracts are there for a reason. I think be pragmatic and make sure things are properly changed in the contract. I'm currently supporting an authority at the moment where deed of variation, yes, it's expensive, but it's absolutely the right thing to do. However, if you're going outside the contract, make sure that all the parties are clear on the expectations, clear on the process, clear on the timescales, clear on the outcomes, and all of that good stuff, and that it's documented. Because if people change, what you don't want is to be going down a certain route and then suddenly someone asks a question which throws everything up into the air, or someone turns around and goes, the contract says this, and again you're kind of back to square one. So find a way that works for all parties, because it needs to get to the right outcome at the end.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. You can't document things enough, I find. What constraints do the panel think that there may be in trying to be more creative? Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, we've probably touched on a lot of these types of things as we've gone through the discussion this afternoon. I mean, time, I think, is a big one. Do people actually have the time to have the discussions they need to have to be able to think creatively and do things differently? I think if you're running out of time, you're more likely to be pushed into the strict contractual compliance, because that's all you've got. We've talked about resource, probably on both sides of the table, to be fair, but I know particularly on the public sector, that's likely to be a constraint. The strength of the relationship, and and how things have gone for the last 20 years, and where that leads you to in terms of the discussions going forward. So I think all of those things will end up being constraints within that process. And actually just, you know, the internal governance and you know, what you are able to agree for your own business and for your own public sector organization, you know, how far you can move outside the box. So I think all of those things will be thrown into the mix and will become challenges and opportunities in the process.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Rosie, any thoughts?
I think from a public sector perspective, don't just think of PFI as a standalone contract, you know, get other people, other stakeholders involved. So quite often a contract manager or a contract management team will be from a certain division within a contracting authority. So it might be finance, it might be assets. If it's a school, it could be education, but actually bring other stakeholders in and find out what's happening on other similar projects to see if there's ideas and suggestions that can be incorporated. Equally from the private sector side, you know, they won't be thinking of it as a standalone project. They'll be thinking what's happening on their other projects. Have those discussions about what's working, what's not working. Have those discussions with your peers. Use the forums, use the, you know, DFE, DFT forums and things like that to discuss what's going on. Be really open and honest about the project. I think there also needs to be, from a public sector perspective, recognising the significance of the existing contract and also what's going to happen or what needs to happen with expiry. So getting that senior buy-in and the senior decision-making processes and the governance involved at an early stage, because there is limited resource, and actually it's the senior, it's the directors and the SROs that can engage additional resource which will be needed, because as I said before, chances are it's the contract manager who will also be thinking about contract expiry, and people do sit there and think, oh, 7 years out, that's a long way away, I probably won't be here then, rather than thinking, well, we need to actively manage this now to make sure it's a smooth transition.
Okay, thank you, Rosie. And Nigel. I don't think Rosie and Sarah have left a lot for me, but I think as with all contracts, not just PFI, you know, it comes down to the relationship between the parties. And, you know, if people are prepared to work creatively, then they can make things happen. So, you know, you've got the public sector client, you've got investors, you've got the FM providers probably still involved. You know, and if there's a willingness to do things, then things can happen. I'd also kind of pick up on Sarah and Rosie's point about resource. I think, you know, I'd question, having sat on a number of SPV boards, does the person doing the day-to-day management on either side of the fence, do they actually have a mandate to do this? Are they incentivized to think creatively? And I think, you know, more encouragement from the kind of, I guess, the boards would help significantly.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. So our final question before we get into the Q&A. I'd like you all to imagine that you are Rishi Sunak's PFI SPAD for the day, and you've been tasked with, well, you've been given a blank canvas to come up with your ideas and suggestions about how best to maximise the value from PFI assets as they return to the public sector. What are you going to do, Rosie?
A couple of things. I think firstly, think, how did I get this job? Anyway, so start by thinking, actually, for me, it's not about expiry. That is a stage in a process, but actually if changes need to be made, they need to be made now, or, you know, sooner. If they need to be made, they need to be made sooner than expiry. If you're not getting the value out of your asset now, why not? And what needs to be changed? What discussions? What needs to be changed with the provider to make sure you are getting that value? I think I am a strong believer that unfortunately the public sector is never going to have sufficient money, and I think, you know, announcements over the next few days will align to that as well. We're never going to have enough money to deliver all the public sector infrastructure that we want. So actually partnerships with the private sector are always going to be needed in some form. So actually there is an element of making sure that the PFI expiry process for all the projects works well because there is a legacy. And let's be really honest, PFI works in other jurisdictions, but it has a really bad name in the UK for whatever reasons. And actually, it's looking at getting the right outcome for each project, in terms of the here and now, but also in terms of the expiry and in terms of the legacy assets. You can see it in PFI assets. Yes, there are some that need improvement, but where you're comparing a council maintained school to a PFI school, in the majority of cases, you can tell which is which, and that really is a legacy. So we need to hold on to that legacy, but we need to make sure it's the right legacy. And there's a lot of work to be done between now and all of the projects expiring, because there's quite a tail on some of those expiring as well.
Thanks, Rosie. You might get to become an MP with performance like that. Nigel?
Yeah, you know, your question was around Richie asking about maximising the value of PFI assets. I think that, you know, the question would be, what do you mean by value? Because if you're saying, well, what we need is a hospital which is in the absolute best condition to deliver the best possible services to the patients and that the staff enjoy, then, you know, it's around you know, making sure that that asset has been maintained through the whole term of the contract, but also that it gets handed back in the best possible condition, whether that's through the slavish adherence to the contract or whether it's thinking creatively to actually make changes, you know, and bring it up to 21st and a bit century standards. You know, we've spoken quite a bit about, you know, the upgrades to buildings. You know, there is a limited amount of money in the pot, in the life cycle pot. And that, you know, I think there needs to be a bit of creative thought around, can the public sector raise short to medium term finance to make upgrades, to really bring it up to the standard it's needed. You know, if you're looking at the financial value, then, you know, is the public body looking at capital receipts because they're going to dispose of it, or are they looking at revenue streams? You know, again, it kind of largely comes back to what you want is a good quality asset, which is as up to date as possible, whether you're going to sublet it or you're going to carry on using it for your own purposes. Totally agree with Rosie's point around the need for private sector investment going forward. You know, there are quite a number of schemes where long-term finance is being used for renewable energy, for instance. But, you know, the country has absolutely enormous challenge with decarbonisation and other major infrastructure investment, and totally agree with Rosie that, you know, this process really has to be seen by people as, well, actually, that was a success. It went through a bit of a torrid time. It got a bit of bad press, but actually what we're getting back as taxpayers, yeah, it was good. Let's go again and let's get private investment in, because, you know, the taxpayer doesn't have £50 billion to insulate all the houses in the country. So we do need private investment, and, you know, but it's got to have political will to do that.
Thanks, Nigel. Private investment and property advice.
And property advice.
And property advice. Sarah, can you finish us off, please?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Rosie and Nigel just said. You know, I'm not going to sit here and say that the private sector has been perfect within the PFI process, but I do think that when you look at PFI assets, a lot of them have been well maintained, and where there have been issues, a lot of the time the private sector has taken the hit to resolve those issues, because that is the nature of the PFI arrangement. I'm biased, but I genuinely think the PFI is better value than it's given credit for, and as Rosie says, it works well in other countries, just not apparently in the UK. So I think there's a lot to like about PFI. I think, you know, what we ought to be doing going forward is taking the good bits and building on them. You know, we've learned the lessons that we've learned from PFI. Let's take that, and let's not wipe the slate clean and start again. Let's take what we already know and build on that going forward to hopefully be able to continue to maintain these assets in a good condition, rather than go back to the old days of building something and then letting it slowly slide into decline over the years. So yes, my view would be it may not be exactly the same as PFI, but let's try and build on what we already know in order to keep these assets in the condition they need to be in.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Well, we now got the Q&A. I think we've got 9 questions in here, so I'll try and, some of them are quite long actually, it's the odd dissertation. So the first question is around, if you move away from like-to-like replacement with a view to decarbonisation, does that invalidate the contract, or do we need a more grown-up negotiation? I'll kick off, and I think, ultimately the parties can agree whatever they want. Obviously there have to be some give and take, but it's, if the authority says actually they want a gas boiler, can you do me a air source heat pump or what have you, then it's down to the parties to agree it.
I would just add to that one, James, that actually if those discussions are happening, bring them on, because we shouldn't be having like-for-like replacements if like-for-like isn't the most appropriate replacement. So if there is something better, more appropriate, have the discussion about it, bring it in.
Yeah, and I think that also just feeds into the comment about actually where do you want to be post expiry, before you divert your funds into renewable assets.
I'd absolutely second that. Coming from the side that will be carrying out those replacements, speak to us if what you want is something different, then the public sector needs to be coming and speaking to their private sector counterparties.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Okay, the next question is around, it's quite long, this one. I'll try and summarise it. So it's an observation that the post-handback, the public sector is not going to have the same level of funding to maintain buildings. Obviously, they won't have PFI credits. And so on that basis, they may not have sufficient funds to keep the assets in the same condition as they would have done under the PFI. And therefore, you're going to end up with lower standards of maintenance. Feedback. I mean, just to, on one level, there may be something of a PFI dividend. Obviously, you're paying off the debt over a period of time. So, any contract you relet, you will not be having to pay the debt element. Although, of course, if you need any upgrades, then, you may need to factor that in.
I think the FM contracts were very gold-plated in terms of the payment mechanism, the standards. Some of the negotiations I was in 20 years ago were quite ridiculous about how quickly the grass had to be cut. It really, but all of that risk was being transferred to the private sector, so it was all priced in. The public sector are, most of their projects they manage in-house or manage with external providers. So it kind of goes back to the earlier point about looking at the options for your FM delivery strategy and setting the right budgets. But the question really kind of highlights, what was one of our supporting topics for PFI through the years was, we'll compare this building, which has been maintained under PFI, versus that where the estates director's had his budget stripped and he doesn't have any money to maintain it. So yeah, it kind of goes back to one of the fundamental points of PFI.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, I don't think that it needs to be viewed as all or nothing. I think there is a middle ground. As Nigel said, you don't necessarily need the service that you've had for the last 25 years, but that's not to say that means you then have to provide everything in-house and find the money to pay for it directly yourself. So there is probably a middle ground there that can at least be considered as one of the options. And again, back to Rosie's point from earlier, actually the cost of taking everything back in-house is probably beyond what the public sector can achieve. So some form of private sector involvement will help with that.
It's why it's so important, though, to think about expiry as early as possible. IPA guidance says 7 years out. My view is as soon as you're starting to do chunky life cycle replacement or needing to do chunky life cycle replacement, that's when you start. And that's about halfway through the contract. and it's establishing what's needed from that asset going forward after expiry. And part of that are the services, the soft services, but also the maintenance of that asset. You've got to look at what will be committed and how it will be committed to the extent it can be committed. And we all know that, you know, this is why PFI, one of the reasons why PFI was generated and created in the first place, is because assets were being built with the intention to maintain, and then they weren't being maintained, because ultimately, if you've got to maintain a school or you need to pay for a teacher, we all know which we prefer, the teachers. It shouldn't be the case, but it's that thought out and considered approach needs to be started as soon as possible.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I think that your comment there touched on another question we've got here around whether the government is ready to commit to long-term partnerships in the way that they were 20 years ago. My view is they're not, but I sense that's probably more tied up with politics than anything else. But any views?
I think in some sectors they are, James, aren't they? And as I said, in energy, renewables, you know, there are a lot of projects going on. You know, it doesn't involve government, but the student accommodation sector, you know, they're not quite PFI, but you know, they're 50-year long-term project finance deals. So there are projects out there. Maybe they don't get the exposure that they used to.
And there is a shift in the change of thinking. PFI's helped that. From a local authority perspective, it used to be short-term in electoral cycles. PFI was a standout from that perspective in terms of committing to a 20-25 plus year contract. I think there's no one size fits all, and I think going forward there needs to be that consideration of actually what are the options, what are the financing options, what are the delivery options, what does that mean for the public sector, the private sector. There's a lot of things up in the air from a government perspective, I think, at the minute.
Okay, thanks, Rosie. And I'm just going to squeeze in one final question before we hit the hour, as we like to keep to time. So what are the panel seeing, and how long out people are looking at expiry? Obviously the guidance says 7 years, but the person posing the question here says that they're finding people, you know, approaching it a lot later than that.
So happy to go first on this one, and my view is start thinking about it as soon as you can. There's no, from my perspective, if you haven't thought about it yet and it's a few years down the line, start thinking about it as quite a priority. But if you get to about that halfway point, start thinking what's needed, how will it be needed, what conversations need to happen, what are the timescales. I suppose the fundamental thing to begin with is, what is your contract expiry date? And I say that quite flippantly, but the amount of people that don't know it is quite scary. So know what your timescales are.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely agree with what Rosie's saying. I mean, I think I would even go a step beyond that and say it should always be, you know, in the back of your mind at any point in these contracts. It kind of comes back to that point about whether you see expiry as a kind of D-Day or just a day in the continuum of the life of the facilities. So in actual fact, you know, anytime you do anything major on these contracts, you know, does it affect expiry? Do we need to think about it? If there's variations, if there's life cycle, etc. You know, I believe it should always be in the back of your mind, so that you're not doing something now that is then going to have a knock-on effect further down the line.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock. I think we'll draw a line under it there. So thanks everyone for attending, and see you on the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.